Hello everyone, I'm Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan and welcome to this segment of the ECSO News. Tonight's segment will be entirely Ask the Sheriff questions. We receive volumes sometimes of requests that come in both by telephone, over Facebook, and sometimes on our blogs. Again, asking the sheriff to address law enforcement issues in our community. When the volume gets such that we can't do it in the segment that's normally associated with Ask the Sheriff, meaning the very end of ECSO News, we will take the entire 30 minutes in order to catch up on our call volume. The episode tonight is one of those that will handle that particular problem. By the way, it's a great problem to have. Continue to ask us questions. I'm Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, and stand by. Yeah, Marie asked the question about school buses and stopping for them, and when you can and cannot pass, or do you have to stop? Marie, the short basic answer is if you're in the lane or lanes traveling behind a school bus or approaching a school bus, if it's a 2-lane road or even a 4-lane road that is not physically separated by a median, meaning that there's a grassy area between it or some sort of concrete abutment, all traffic must stop. If you're on a 4-lane or even a 2-lane highway that has a median separation, meaning that you'd have to drive through or down or over some sort of barrier to get to the opposing lane, you're not required to stop. So if you're behind a school bus and they stop, or you're approaching a school bus and they stop and the flag and the stop sign goes out, if you will, everyone has to stop if you're on the same traffic flow as the school bus. If you're separated from that traffic flow, meaning by a physical median, there is no legal requirement for you to stop if you're coming with the traffic flow in the opposite direction. Hopefully that answers your question. We have a kind of a general question, meaning that this question has a couple of elements to it that are asked by different people. Number one, the question is why are we using Tahoe vehicles for police vehicles as opposed to cheaper vehicles or smaller vehicles or more gas efficient vehicles? And why do officers leave their cars running while they're engaged in certain police activities? So, and let me take the first one, part of this question, why Tahoes? Several years ago, we went from Crown Vics and other vehicle makes, and even today we have some vehicles that are not Tahoes. We have some Chevrolet Impalas, and we try to spread out the cars that we buy and not stick with one manufacturer. We also have some Fords, some Explorers, and those sorts of things. So again, that's to kind of share the tax dollar, if you will, with the different automobile vendors. But we went to Tahoes because, number one, they stopped making the Crown Vic and the police packages. The gas mileage is basically the same on the Tahoes. The Tahoes are more expensive, though, per vehicle, but they also last longer. Prior to getting the Tahoes, our batteries and alternators were good for about maybe a year to 18 months. As you can well imagine, these cars pull a tremendous amount of electricity. So we were replacing alternators and batteries. And so when we went to the new car, and by the way, we are not the only agency that did that. Almost always we're lagging behind new police equipment and that sort of thing. Rarely are we a test bed for things. And so the Tahoe was already in production with a police package. It's about 3 inches lower than your standard Tahoe. It has a stiffened frame. It doesn't ride as well as a family Tahoe. We also have vehicles that are flex fuel, meaning if we ever go to the biodegradable fuels, etc., the vehicles can also be used for that. But your gas mileage is pretty much a wash with what it used to be with the other ones. We found with the Tahoes, and we were promised this, by the way, by the manufacturers, that the life of the alternator and the battery would be what it would be with a normal vehicle. Now, you may or may not know, but inside this vehicle, in addition to the air conditioning, our folks sometimes are running an automatic license plate reader. They have their CAD system computer in the car. They have a printer. Throw in a cell phone there to keep their cell phones charged, because many times We don't transmit over the radio, certain information or items that we're wanting, of course, at that particular juncture, to make sure we're communicating privately with each other and there's no bleed over on the radio. Maybe you're at a scene and you want to discuss something with your supervisor, or you want to discuss something even with sometimes a victim. You certainly don't want that coming over the radio and everybody else that's on that channel throughout the county understanding that we've just had a sexual assault victim somewhere. So all of those pieces of equipment are continually running in a car, and now for certain vehicles, let's throw in the canine. And so now we have a vehicle with all of that equipment, 2 additional fans in the back that have to be in there to keep the canine cool, and they even have fans in there at the times they turn the vehicle off to get the hot air out of a vehicle. As you can well imagine, you can't close an animal up in a car. So there's a reason for those vehicles running all of the time, because if the officer also turns that vehicle off, the possibility of getting it started sometimes is slim and none, especially if you have all that equipment running and plugged in, you've got your emergency gear running, and now you pull up to a scene and you turn your vehicle off. There's a probability sometimes of vehicles not restarting. So, we look at those policies and procedures all the time. Is it cost effective to turn the vehicle on and not turn the vehicle off? While again, to the average citizen not engaged in law enforcement, not knowing what I just described to you, that's another one of those very easy criticisms. As is the last part of that. If you didn't buy these vehicles and you bought cheaper vehicles, you could do deputy pay raises. Not really. Folks, do you really think we haven't scrubbed this budget up one side and down the other? My job at the Escambia County Sheriff's Office is to not spend your tax dollars. My job is to contain costs and, again, be as cost efficient as possible. We're prepared for those questions to be asked when we take our budget to the governor, because questions like that will be asked. Are you driving around, Sheriff, in Cadillacs? Why are you buying everything, at the Cadillac price when everybody else is driving, again, the family sedan? We're driving the family sedan. We're being very cost effective with your tax dollars, and we'll continue to buy those vehicles because really that's the best rate going right now. Anthony asked the questions about the legality of fireworks in Florida, and how does it apply to the noise ordinances? Well, Andy, we really don't have a county-wide ordinance on noise, number one. They've tried it several times, and then you get the beach activities involved, and the county commission takes an approach that they want a county-wide ordinance. One of our local dance clubs, violated the quote-unquote noise ordinance for a while, and we attempted to enforce that. County commission got engaged, and that became a big ordinance fight, et cetera, with an understanding, Anthony, that we don't write ordinances or statutes, laws, as they're commonly referred to. We merely enforce them. Occasionally we're asked our opinion, but very rarely, by the way, on their enforceability and that sort of thing. And I will tell you, the ordinance that is written is almost unenforceable by the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, and here's why. The requirement, because again, this is politics, so county commissioners get involved with constituents, and they're trying to get an ordinance skewed so it's doesn't quote unquote hurt one of their constituents or a local business. And what they create here is an unworkable ordinance, much like our panhandling ordinance. You don't see us aggressively going after panhandling. Why? Because we have so many of those thrown out because of the attacks by the ACLU and the Criminal Defense Bar that it's a waste of officers' time to do that. The noise ordinance is much the same. As I recall, the last time that was really an issue was out in Perdido Key at one of the local clubs. The ordinance was first the officer shows up, gives a warning. If it's beyond noise level, we're having to take decibel meter readings, by the way. If it's beyond a certain amount of feet from the building, first you issue a verbal warning. So you go in and get a hold of the manager or the owner and say, hey, you've got to turn this down. You're in violation of county ordinance, whatever the decibel reading is such. The officer, that's all they can do, first contact. So they leave, and then they have to wait at least 30 minutes. If there's any further complaints, they come back and take a second reading. And if the reading's above this, they get another warning, and this warning is you will be cited. And then finally, on the third contact, if you can believe this, a ticket will be issued, of which the max, I think, was $500 is the most it could be. And we had many clubs say, just give us a citation, we'll pay the citation. So again, that's an unworkable law from a couple perspectives. Number one, it doesn't solve the problem that you're wanting to solve, and that's noise. And number two, it ties a law enforcement officer up on such a very, very low-level misdemeanor, a local ordinance, if you will. Actually, it's an ordinance violation in violating the peace. So, we don't, as you well know, we don't have enough officers to, basically, go with that. And what you're asking me also to do, Anthony, and not just me, it's all law enforcement agencies, you're wanting me to modify social behavior. I'm old enough to remember there was a time that a phone call was all you needed to do, and if your neighbor was having a loud party or a group of people over and the kids maybe were out playing and getting too loud, you just called and said, hey, Bill, I got to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock. I've got to go to work. Could you guys hold it down a little bit over there? And neighbors would do that very thing. Why? Because we had a certain level of kindness and socialization with each other, that we understood we were our community. We all live together, and there's certain things that we must do to maintain an orderly society. Today we turn to law enforcement. We want to force, if you will, by enforcing, certain rules, regulations, laws, statutes, let's call them whatever you will, that will make you modify your behavior and comply with what used to be referred to as a decent society. On fireworks, that's controlled, Anthony, primarily by the state fire marshal. We have state laws that apply to fireworks when they can and can't be used in the city limits, outside the city limits. But we run into many of the same problems. Of course, they're a little more lenient and lax in the county. But the issue is again, we have somebody violating an ordinance, across the county or across town. Do we really want law enforcement officers tied up responding to, again, higher level of crimes, going basically with a noise ordinance? So, it has to do with priorities. While I know that's probably not the answer that you want, it is the correct answer.
Question is, I'd like to know how the sheriff believes that medical marijuana will affect Escambia County.
Jenna asked, how do I feel or believe that medical marijuana will affect Escambia County? Well, Jenna, quite obviously it'll affect the state of Florida and not just Escambia County. But to be specific, I've always taken the position on medical marijuana that, and by the way, this is a little bit, I will tell you up front that I'm breaking somewhat with other law enforcement agency heads and professionals. I'm not qualified enough to in any way engage with the medical profession to dictate to them what they should and should not prescribe for medications for their patients. I would not be so presumptuous as to lecture a doctor on medications, any new medication or old medication for that matter. Marinol has been around for a very, very long time, late 60s, early 70s, which can be taken in a pill or a patch form, which is, again, medical THC, which is the content in marijuana. It's a very low amount that is there, and it's been available for prescription for some time, but again, in very limited cases. I think what you're going to see here, and what we fear in law enforcement, is that the passage of medical marijuana is just step one to the final legalization of marijuana. Study after study has proven that marijuana used in the forms that you see on the street, because the THC content is extremely high. A lot of people my age and older, don't understand that the THC content in today's marijuana is nothing like the marijuana they smoked back in the 60s, when marijuana was the drug of choice and it was a craze. And this is where all of the folks that are banging the drum for legalization across the board talk about it's no worse than alcohol, etc. I don't engage in those circular debates. I normally, as I'm doing with answering your question, is go back to the data that I am familiar with, that I have read. So medical marijuana, again, I won't debate that. I think that's left up to the medical profession. I know I find it a little disconcerting that the American Medical Association, the American Ophthalmic Association, and many of those who were brought into this debate will tell you that there's little or no available data to show the efficacy of actually prescribing these drugs. So, but again, that's the medical profession, and if they're having issue with that, then they won't prescribe it, and I pretty much leave it at that. My concern for marijuana across the board is its eventual legalization. I would tell folks to check some of the data coming out of Colorado and some of the states that have basically legalized marijuana, and they have some huge social issues right now. It's much like gambling. There are folks who will benefit tremendously from the legalization of gambling, drugs, etc. And society as a whole suffers for it, because who pays for the drug addiction that's rampant? Who pays for the loss of jobs, et cetera, in the community when gambling comes in and it sucks the life out of your community, where all of the other businesses, except for the large casino complexes, go out of business? You know, the local hoteliers, the mom and pop restaurants, and those sorts of things. If you don't work for the large casino, you don't work. And so that's something as a society we need to look at. My approach is I enforce laws, I don't make laws. And so if my community decides to legalize marijuana, I'll do the best that I can to enforce the laws such as they are. Same goes with gambling. My personal preference as to whether I agree or disagree with either one of those things really doesn't matter in this debate. You know, the day that I come to work and decide I'm going to enforce the laws that I agree with and not the ones that I don't is the day I shouldn't be sheriff. Tracy asked a question, and it's kind of tied into some other citizens' requests about, you know, how the deputies utilize their agency-issued vehicle. Basically, again, if you're a sworn law enforcement officer, either in patrol or in investigations, you're assigned a vehicle, which obviously the vehicle is assigned primarily for your use for duty. We authorize their use of that vehicle and their uniforms, by the way, when they're engaged in off-duty employment. We have contracts with certain businesses around town where they can call and request, you know, an off-duty deputy, and then they pay the deputy's salary for that time. Now, when a deputy takes that position, it all goes through a central scheduling office. And by the way, this is all approved by Florida statute. This is not just something that we do here locally. Part of the money that the officers pay, $3, goes back to the agency, and that's to cover, you know, the gas, insurance, etc., for the car. Also, when a deputy is on an off-duty status employment job, meaning they're not physically on duty with the sheriff's office, they're required to answer any officer needs assistance call. And the owners of the businesses that they're employed at understand that the deputy may in fact have to leave that business if an officer assistance calls. So we kind of, you know, that's a force multiplier, if you will, that when you're on duty and you call for assistance, let's say there's someone at you know, one of the local you know, grocery stores who's hired deputies to work off-duty security there. If you need assistance and you call, that deputy has to leave that off-duty location and respond to your officer needs assistance call. So, you know, that's one of the very upsides to those sorts of things. And the county is reimbursed again for the use of the vehicle, gas, etc. The question about, you know, the vehicle for personal use, the primary reason, or the primary answer to that question, and the bottom line is, vehicles cannot be used, with rare exception, for your own personal use, meaning you can't go to the grocery store, you can't take the kids to soccer, you can't take the kids to school, etc. It's not your personal use vehicle. It has to be in some way tied to, you know, your duty performance. Now, we offer a little bit of latitude in that. Why? Because again, we like for officers to have officer presence throughout the community. So if an officer's on the way home and they want to, you know, stop at the local Tom Thumb or Circle K and grab a cup of coffee on the way home while they're still in uniform, you know, that too is a force multiplier, meaning that there are deputies all over the county. So, you know, we take a little bit of latitude, if you will, in that. But for the vehicle to be used as personal use, that is not approved. Leslie asked, what kind of quote-unquote real gang activity do we have in Escambia County other than drug dealing? Leslie, when I took office, the approach from the local governments, you know, both city and county, was to basically ignore that there was any gang issues in Escambia County. I will tell you that, you know, I did a career in the United States Air Force. I did a lengthy tour of duty in California prior to being assigned to Florida when I retired out at Eglin Air Force Base. And then my family and I moved to Pensacola, into Escambia County. It became very apparent to me, moving over here in 1993, that there was gang and/or gang activity in Escambia County. And the reason why is because when you drove around town or drove around the county, you know, I would observe the gang graffiti. It's called tagging in the game parlance, meaning that we want to mark our territory and let folks know that, you know, our gang is here, we've been through this area. Many times it's used to taunt each other, meaning I make an incurrence on another gang's turf, and the way I prove that is I tag your area. So now you know that the Bloods or the Crips or whatever the gang is has gone past their gang boundaries and gone into yours. And as you can well imagine, over those minor incursions, because it's all about saving face and machismo and everything else, that that can start a shooting war. Now, we're very fortunate in Escambia County. Most of our gangs are what we call local or hybrid gangs. At last count, we're up to about 21 or 22 local gangs. We kind of leveled off at 17 for some time. The reason why I call them gangs is, Florida has a gang statute, and if you meet certain criteria, any organized group of people can in fact be categorized as a criminal gang, a criminal activity. If not, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts could be, called a gang because they meet all the criteria except for, their primary purpose is, the engagement in criminal activity, whether it's the selling of drugs, prostitution, it could be murder, theft, there are organized burglary rings, etc. On any given day in Escambia County, we estimate through the use of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement statistics and the Attorney General's Gang Task Force folks that we have probably about 300 individuals engaged in criminal activity that we can tie to a gang in Escambia County. But you are correct, their primary means of income, if you will, generation, as with almost everything today, it's somehow tied with drugs. Some of the larger gangs, and we do have some motorcycle gangs in Escambia County. We have at least 2 that have a semi-permanent residence. We have many that traverse our county. They also are engaged in that. Some, they're involved in strong-arm sides of gang activity, which is enforcement. Where they, criminal activity requires certain legitimate businesses to pay protection. That's very low level here. Occasionally you'll get a gang that does, murders for hire. That's very low level here, by the way. It's usually prostitution, some counterfeiting, some illegal activity involving credit cards. Some of these areas are outside what we do in Escambia County at the Sheriff's Office. While we detect it, we don't necessarily do the long investigation. Like in the event of counterfeiting of credit cards, that belongs to the United States Secret Service. So when we detect that, we'll work the initial front part of that activity and then turn it over to the United States Secret Service because that's specifically in their charter involving credit cards and counterfeiting, etc. So we've got, what I would call gang activity in Escambia County. I think for similar communities our size and some larger, we almost always mirror national averages. But I will also tell you as a citizen, if you are not in the bad part of town, if you will, where there's a lot of criminal activity, prostitution, drug dealing, and you avoid those areas, you probably won't be a victim of this crime. As I tell folks, the study of victimization is very big. So while you hear what I've said and it's somewhat alarming because you're not aware of the breadth and depth of the criminal activity in our county, especially involving gangs, the probability of you becoming a victim of one of those crimes is very small if you're not visiting that area of town or hanging out in the venues that they do. If you're not hanging out in known biker bars or gang bars, you're probably not going to be a victim of any of that. Trouble will follow you if you determine that that's where you want to go. So again, if you're just the average everyday citizen, the chances of you ever having any contact with this sort of criminal activity is slim and none. Jennifer asked about partnering with our animal control folks in starting a program. I know there's programs in other areas like this where inmates are brought in to not only assist at the kennels, but they refer to them as jail dogs, and the inmates actually help with the care and the feeding and the maintenance and cleanup of facilities, and it's part of their rehabilitation process. Well, of course, again, Jennifer, we don't run the jail. We're not engaged with the detention activities. But I would certainly call your county commissioner and make that recommendation. I know at one time there was a similar program years ago in Escambia County where that was part of a rehabilitation program with inmates where it taught them to be responsible in the caring and feeding of an animal. And of course the county also benefited from the fact that they had additional workers over at the kennels. I know that putting animals down is a terrific thing. My wife and I are both animal lovers. We have a pet. But I can also tell you that sometimes our overpopulation in Escambia County of cats and dogs, and especially cats, can be overwhelming. There are no-kill facilities. The SPCA here in town is a no-kill facility, and so they take a lot of animals in. Some animals will put down because of their breed. The vicious animals that are involved in attacks on humans, unfortunately, are normally put down when they're put into the facility. But we don't run animal control at the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, and so again, I would direct you back to your Board of County Commissioners, and specifically the commissioner for your district, and ask them about implementing that program.
When I'm driving and I see a erratic driver, who do I call? Do I call 911, or do I? Is there any information I need to know, or what do I need to do?
Datari asked, what should he do when he's out in his vehicle and he observes erratic driving? Someone crossing the center line or running off the road. Should you dial 911, and then what specifically or what action should you take? Number one, be safe. We always recommend that you back away from that driver. Do not try to pass. So stay behind the vehicle. Again, get out of that lane if at all possible, as quickly as possible. And yes, dial 911. Information that we need is your location and the location, of course, of the car, obviously, that you're calling in. And again, as good a description as you can give. If you're good at vehicle makes and years, then please give us that. And of course, the all-important license number that you can give us. And then the dispatcher will ask you to describe the type of erratic driving. Then the nearest patrol will be dispatched. Many times we'll even patch over and get an assist from the Florida Highway Patrol. So again, call it in. Do not intervene yourself. Remember, you are not a law enforcement officer. In today's world especially, you do not know what you might encounter with a confrontation with some driver. It could turn into road rage. And remember, a vehicle is thousands of pounds of weapon. And you'll always come out on the short end of the stick if you get into that sort of confrontation with another driver. So again, dial 911, make a color of the vehicle and the all-important license number and your location and exactly what the driver of that vehicle is doing. And then again, if you want to follow or they ask you to follow, make sure that it's at a safe distance back. Again, we don't want you to end up in an accident. Remember, you can also email your questions and ask the sheriff at escambiaso.com. We'll be back next week right here on Blab TV Tuesday night at 8 p.m.